March 28, 1973, Nixon ordered home the last of the 25,000 U.S. combat soldiers stationed in Vietnam. The last American soldiers began returning home from war. It was not the type of homecoming they expected, certainly not the homecoming promised by a grateful nation. The country did not know what to make of these veterans. They had left their homes to be part of a great adventure. They were young, the youngest army the United States had ever furnished.
That's what Vietnam was for me. It was kind of like the Wild West. We had a bunch of kids running around, heavily armed with explosives. As long as we didn't do anything too awful, they more or less let us do what we wanted. You know, it was bad. It was, you know, we didn't want to take any casualties ourselves, but at that time inflicting casualties was what we were there for. And it beat the hell out of the stateside Marine Corps with their polishing your boots and your brace and everything every day. So it was kind of a hoot for a 19-year-old.
I wanted to fight at the time. I thought going to war was the ultimate thing. And the Marine Corps was at that time bearing the brunt of the fighting in Vietnam. And I guess I was trying to prove something to myself that I could do it.
Most were mere boys from the farms of the Midwest or the factory towns and cities of the East.
I think one of the things pushed me towards joining the military was the things that happened to my father, you know, being a sharecropper. Some of the old farmers, they would cheat him at the end of the year, and they would go through all this altercation about trying to split who's supposed to get what share of the pie, and the way some of them talked to him. I felt being a soldier that people wouldn't talk to me that way because I really didn't know what I was getting into, but at the same time, I believed it was a better life than being a farmer, especially a sharecropper.
I was just 17, so I didn't have to worry about the draft too much. But one day as I'm walking home from school, I went by the federal building at the recruiter's office, and I went up and talked to them. And I joined the Marines. And I got home, and my mother asked me where I'd been, and I said, I just joined the Marines. And she said, no, you didn't, because she had to sign. But my dad talked to her, said if that's what I wanted to do, that she should sign it. They signed, and I joined March 13th, 1967, and I went to boot camp in July 1967.
The average Marine, somebody like me, weighed about 155 pounds, soaking wet, and had to carry a roll of quarters in his pocket to make weight so he could go in the Corps. Eldon wore brand new shoes so he would be tall enough that he figured he'd be able to get in there. Those guys lay their lives down for you.
The majority were poor and undereducated because the rich had the money to avoid the draft.
We had 3 or 4 cigarette factories, all kinds of distilleries. You had Ford, you had Alcoa. Yeah, I mean, these people, the only thing they asked from you was one thing, not a high school diploma, and that was, did you have your draft done? Once you had your draft done, if you were 15 years old, you could get a job if you had your draft done. But I didn't have my draft done. Got turned down by 4 companies, so I just said, well, I think draft's more important. But luckily, I had a pretty hard-headed second lieutenant that said, you will, by the time you get out at 6 months, you'll have your GED, and I did. I mean, when a lieutenant got you back then, and he stood in front of you and he stared you down, you didn't bat an eye, you knew he meant business. So I did it, and I got my GED.
They had traveled far during their tour of duty. Very few had ever been more than a day's journey from the place of their birth. They had witnessed much, too much for anyone so young and inexperienced.
Did we waste part of our life? Guy was my best man. Was killed over there. What the hell did he die for? If you're going to pull out. I don't know if any of this makes sense.
The horrors of what they had seen and done transfixed their eyes into a 1,000-mile stare, a stare that only those who had shared their life could understand. And now they were home, and the country did not know what to do with them.
I had a lot of friends that died, a lot of friends that went in after me that have had a lot of mental problems with Vietnam. So it's still going on with a lot of people. I wish they could get over it, but I don't think some of them will ever come back.
A lot of vets from all different wars have survivor guilt. They survived when their buddies didn't, or they didn't have a family and their buddy did. And why did his buddy have to die? You know, because he had a family and all that other stuff. I had a problem with that, or had a serious problem with that when I first came back from Vietnam, when I got out of the service too. But I reconciled myself to that. It's not my fault that I survived. It's not my fault that they didn't. It's just the luck of the draw.
There must have been a million different ways to keep track of time. And you always wanted to see one more sun come up one more time, and you knew 365 days hence you'd be able to get on one of those big birds and come back to the land of the big PX, we called it. So you look forward to it, and it finally comes, and you're exhausted, and you get on. I was flying out of Saigon, and it's a 22-hour flight coming home. Clark Air Force Base, Guam, Hawaii, and then Travis Air Force Base, north of San Francisco.
It was not the homecoming of their fathers.
And I got there, and it was dark, and when I got into the San Francisco terminal, I had the greatest culture shock I've ever experienced in my life, because nobody paid any attention. You see, my dad had told all the stories about coming home from World War II. I'd actually seen my dad come home as a 3-year-old. I can remember that. And here was a bunch of people who, you know, the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And I experienced a ton of indifference, because here was business as usual, and I'd been at the, not only in combat 10 days before, I'd been at the Way City battle, where the eyes of the whole world had been focused on.
But now that he was home, his country's focus was elsewhere.
And here were hundreds and hundreds of my fellow countrymen who appeared indifferent to what was going on there in South Vietnam. So that shock of coming back, I was met by my mother, my father, Center College roommate, and my wife. Were met me when I got off the plane in a snowstorm, March the 21st, 1968. And, you know, I'm convinced that the trauma, the delayed stress syndrome that they attribute to Vietnam veterans greater than other wars, I'm convinced that it has more to do with how the society treated them when they came home than it is from the delayed stress of the combat experience. We were flown directly home. World War II, you came home on a troop ship. Took you 30 days to decompress, and you were with people who understood your experience. And there was meaning to what you had done. There was no meaning to what we had done, and we were denied. You came instantly back into this country, and you did hear the anti-war uptake. You did hear people called baby killers.
It was a war that began as most wars do, with flags waving, children cheering, women saying tearful goodbyes, and old men urging them to great deeds of heroism. for in the early days the war was popular. The righteousness of their crusade was doubted by very few. They marched to war with the promises that a thankful nation would honor and reward them upon their return. But now they found anything but honor, and the rewards had gone to those who stayed safely at home. Their war lost its luster.
Got spit on, had stuff thrown at me. You know, I was in uniform. I think one thing that sticks with me, when I came back, I was dating a girl, and her dad come in after dinner one night, and we were sitting down talking, and he said, I understand you were in the Marine Corps. I said, yeah. He says, I understand you were in Vietnam. I said, yes, sir, I was. He said, you know, I appreciate if you wouldn't see my daughter anymore. And I said, why is that, sir? And he said, well, I've heard about you all Marines. He said, you're all nothing but a rowdy group, and baby killers and crap like that. And I said, you're right, sir. I said, I was just on the verge of slaughtering your whole family. And that's how I said it. And you know, for a long time there, for years, I played semi-pro softball, and a lot of the guys that I was on the team with were ex-Green Berets or ex-Marines, and we clumped together. We didn't talk a lot about what we did, but it was a feeling of camaraderie, and I think that's the biggest thing that I cherish from the Marine Corps and Vietnam, but that I missed the most was the camaraderie. Because, I mean, you know, you may be very close with your wife, you may be close with your girlfriend, but it's nothing like being in a foxhole with another combat veteran and seeing people getting killed and killing people yourself. And you know, and you share everything. It's just the feelings, the emotions that you have. It's you know, the only intimacy that's not there is the honeymoon night. I mean, you're so close. You're so close together. You really are.
As the casualty lists grew, so did the resentment. The nation no longer cared for the war or the warrior. In fact, the war had led to conflicts on the home front.
I came back, I went home to see my folks on leave, wanted to see some of my old high school buddies. When I found a few of the old high school chums, I couldn't relate to them at all. They were still concerned about fast cars and girls and the things that young men were concerned with, and nothing made sense. Everything seemed unrelative. Seemed like being back here in the world was like living in a fairy tale or something. Nothing seemed real, nothing was important. So, as a result, I isolated more from my peers. I associated with Marines.
Draft boards were burned. Troops marching to join their comrades in battle were spat upon. The riots even forced the president to send troops to the cities to restore order. All this was of little importance to the returning warriors. Now they were home and had every reason to believe that they were to benefit materially from their service, the debt the public said was owed to them. But there was no payment, no hearty handshake or thankful pat on the back. Instead, they were told they were out of step with the civilians they returned to join. They retreated into their own world and became a subculture sharing a single view of what that world should be like.
And had garbage thrown at me at the airport. And I went home and I came back. While I was home, my brother and sister were war protesters, and so I got some rejection from my family, so I went back to San Francisco, worked as brig guard in Armed Forces Police there, and I hung around Marines until I went back to Vietnam.
Their jobs were gone to those that had avoided the military service. They were told that they were fools for having gone to war. Discrimination against the veteran was such a serious issue that it became advisable for the men not to disclose their military service.
When I got out of the service, I grew a beard and grew my hair long. Went to college. Didn't even want to hear about it. Didn't even want to know about it. Didn't think about it. Just put it right out of my head. The only people who knew I'd ever been in the military were some people I went to high school with, I went to college with, and my family, basically. That's it.
Many thought that a soldier's life was evil. Some even blamed America's growing drug abuse problem on the soldiers. The war had become a convenient target on which to blame America's drug use.
Guys talking about being spit on when they come back, or being, you know, cursed at, or called a baby killer. I never experienced any of that in Louisville. What I experienced, I considered was worse. Nobody cared. Nobody cared, and nobody cared until probably the 80s and the 90s. The 70s, they were making movies about us because we were all crazed killers, you know, running around doing things. But, you know, ever movie had come out that had some psycho, he was a Vietnam vet.
With all this anti-veteran sentiment, it was no wonder that many simply gave up their attempts to return to a normal life and began to call the streets home.
You know, we didn't have parade. You know, we didn't have all the glorified stuff that the guys, which they rightly should, the kids coming back from Iraq. But I think, you know, they're going through the same thing that we did. You know, they call it post-traumatic stress. Well, it was. You know, 24 or 30 hours ago, you're in a combat situation, you're killing people, and people beside you are getting killed, and 30 hours later, you're in the States. And it was ironic. I could get, I couldn't walk into a bar. I was 18, almost 19 years old, couldn't walk into a bar. But 30 hours ago, I was killing people, literally doing that. So it was a big mental adjustment.
On every street corner, veterans, still wearing what was left of their uniforms, could be seen asking for a handout. Most wondered why the government could not spend at least a fraction of the money spent on the war to help those who had fought it. And even when they thought they were safe, out of the clutches of death, death followed them home. Citizen soldiers have always fought America's wars. The call has always been punctuated by the sound of bugle, the beat of drums, and politicians' promises of rewards, honors, and support.
I think we were asked to do something that no other American soldiers had ever been asked to do, and that fight the longest war in American history when victory wasn't our objective. And as MacArthur said, there's no substitute for victory. And I think that this country broke faith with the American military in the Vietnam War that's never been repaired and never been replaced. And despite the so-called success or victory in the Persian Gulf, and I applaud those guys that went there, the breach of faith hasn't been healed yet.
Once the last cannon fired in Vietnam, these soldiers were put on a shelf and forgotten like a child's toy soldiers.
I have a grandson in Iraq now. I don't want him going through what we did. For what?
It was up to the soldiers to find their own peace and finally receive their long overdue welcome home.
But when we came down with our own banner and our own float, and people on the side of the road started standing up and applauding, there wasn't a dry eye in that group. I mean, we had guys, one guy was missing limbs and people wearing parts of uniforms and this and that, and it was a homecoming that we'd never gotten. It was just very emotional.
When I hear the Marine Corps hymn, you cry. It's a pride. We didn't get drafted. We volunteered. And you volunteer to want to be a Marine. And you're not guaranteed you're going to be one. The turnover rate's hell. And I think, I think you can line up 10 or 15 guys that were in the different branches of service, and I'm pretty sure the majority of the time, after you either talk to them or see them, you can tell which one's Marines. You can tell. And regardless of whatever I do with the rest of my life, they can't take that away from me.
Welcome home, soldier. Thank you for your service.